You know that feeling? When you open up your news feed and it's just an avalanche of economic terms and you see the government changing policies left and right.
Oh, yeah.
And it's tough to figure out what it all means, right? Like,
Right.
how does any of this actually impact me, in my daily life? You almost need a PhD in economics just to understand what they're even talking about half the time.
It can feel that way, absolutely.
Well, we get it. We feel that too. And that's kind of the whole point of what we do here. We're trying to cut through all that noise and make it relatable, just for you.
And that's what we're doing today, right? We're going deep, a deep dive into this book, Rollback, Repealing Big Government Before the Coming Fiscal Collapse.
That's right. Strong title, right?
Definitely grabs your attention.
Yeah. And we're going right to the source, using excerpts from the book itself to break down the main ideas.
Straight to the core arguments.
Exactly. So our mission today is pretty simple. We want to unpack what rollback is all about. It's a critique of big government. It dives into a potential fiscal collapse that the author sees, and then it lays out some pretty radical solutions.
And we're going to try to do it in a way that makes sense and doesn't leave you feeling like you need to go back to school.
Yeah, exactly. No Econ 101 prerequisites here. Okay, so let's jump right in. What's the main argument against big government that this book is making? Like, what's the core issue?
Well, the author comes out swinging, basically saying that the federal government, instead of making things better and helping us move forward, is actually holding us back.
Holding us back how?
Well, they say it hurts our overall well-being and lowers our standard of living. It's not just that they think it's inefficient, they see it as a negative force, a real drag on our potential.
Wow, okay, that's a pretty serious claim. And they don't mince words either. I remember that part where they compare the government to a parasite.
Oh, yeah. That one definitely sticks with you. They actually say it's a net minus for humanity. Like when you add up all the good and bad, the bad outweighs the good.
Which is pretty different from what a lot of people believe about the government's role, right?
Very different.
So what's the logic behind such a strong stance?
So the way they see it, real progress, the stuff that makes our lives measurably better, that comes from the private sector. They say the private sector is dynamic, innovative, and it's held back by the government.
So government is a barrier, not a facilitator.
In their view, yeah. They're asking this fundamental question: can society really thrive with all this government involvement? Or would we be better off with a lot less of it?
So it's not just about the size, it's about the very idea of the government being involved in so many aspects of our lives.
That's exactly it.
They also talk about this idea that the government creates division, sets up this zero-sum game. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Basically, they argue that whenever the government steps in to redistribute resources, which is kind of their main thing, it sets up different groups against each other. Individuals, businesses, states, even different generations, they're all competing for a piece of the pie.
And the pie is ultimately controlled by the government, right?
Right. And that zero-sum idea, that means for someone to win, someone else has to lose.
Right, like a fixed pie. Someone gets a bigger slice, someone else gets a smaller one.
Exactly.
Now, here's something I found really interesting. They don't present the looming fiscal collapse as just a disaster. They almost frame it as a potential opportunity.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
How does that work?
Okay, so they're saying this potential crisis, while definitely not going to be fun, could actually be the push we need to make some really big changes.
Like a reset button.
Kind of, yeah.
Mhm.
A chance to shrink the government down to a size they believe is much more appropriate. The idea is that the crisis, painful as it may be, forces us to rethink things and do things differently.
So not just tinkering around the edges, they're talking about a pretty dramatic shift.
A major overhaul. They're basically trying to make the case that we could do away with a lot of what we consider essential and not only survive, but thrive.
Really challenging the status quo.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got a critique of big government and this, maybe not so gloomy, look at a potential fiscal crisis. Let's move on to the second major argument. This idea that a fiscal crisis is not just a possibility, it's inevitable. The author's saying, we're already on this path and there's no turning back.
Right.
So what are the main factors they see driving us towards this crisis? What's their breakdown?
So they lay out three big trends, all connected to demographics in the economy. First, you've got the baby boomers, a huge generation, who are retiring and starting to rely on Social Security and Medicare.
Right, putting a strain on those systems.
Exactly. Then you've got declining birth rates. That means fewer workers in the future to pay into these programs.
And fewer taxpayers overall.
Exactly. And the third factor is that we're living longer. That's great news, of course. But it also means more years of healthcare costs, especially as we age.
So it's a double whammy.
Yeah.
More retirees living longer and fewer people working to support them.
It's a recipe for trouble, for sure.
So basically what they're saying is that the promises the government made about Social Security, Medicare, all these entitlements, they were based on some pretty rosy assumptions that just haven't panned out.
Yeah, they use this analogy of a chain letter. It works great as long as new people keep signing up. But if those new people dry up...
The whole thing collapses.
Exactly.
And they back this up with some pretty stark numbers.
Oh, yeah. They point out that if birth rates stay where they are now, by 2040, there will be almost twice as many people 65 and over as there are school-aged kids. That's a massive shift.
A huge change in who's working and who's relying on those who are working.
Right. And it's not just the number of retirees, it's also the age they're retiring. Back in 1950, the average age people started taking Social Security was 69. Now it's 63.
People are retiring earlier and living longer, which really puts the squeeze on the system.
Totally. Plus, the percentage of men in their late 60s who are still working, that's gone way down.
I could see how that would make a big difference.
A huge difference. And, it's not just a U.S. problem. Globally, populations are aging.
Right. So it's not like we could just count on other countries to help us out.
Not really. See, we've been relying a lot on foreign countries to finance our debt, like buying up our treasury bonds. But if countries like China, for example, they're dealing with their own aging populations, they're going to need that money at home.
So there's going to be less money available to lend to us.
Potentially, yeah. It becomes a global competition for capital.
Makes sense. Now, I'm guessing they probably address this idea of just raising taxes to fix this fiscal mess, right? What's their take on that?
They are not fans. They say it's not nearly enough to fix the problem, and on top of that, it would be politically almost impossible to raise taxes that much.
I guess it would be pretty unpopular.
To say the least. And part of their argument is that people have this misconception about Social Security, what they call the trust fund myth.
You mean that idea that there's this big pot of money sitting there waiting for us when we retire?
Exactly. They argue that's just not true. The money coming in from payroll taxes is mostly being used to pay current benefits, not being saved for the future.
So there's not actually a big trust fund that's been built up over the years.
Not in the way most people think. They say this whole misunderstanding gives people a false sense of security.
Making them think the problem isn't as urgent as it really is.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a core critique of big government and a pretty serious warning about a fiscal crisis. Now let's get into some of the examples they use to show how government intervention can backfire. They start with Detroit. What's their point there?
Detroit's a cautionary tale. They use it to show what can happen when government programs and regulations fail. The population's been plummeting since the 1950s, schools are closing, housing prices have tanked. They see this as a systemic breakdown, and they blame it partly on bad government policies.
So it's a real-world example of how things can go wrong.
Exactly.
And they draw a distinction between different groups in Detroit, don't they?
Yeah. While a lot of the private sector was suffering job losses and pay cuts, they argue that people who worked for the government or relied on government benefits, they actually fared better.
The tax eaters, as they call them.
Yep. They use that to show how the government can be doing okay while the people it's supposed to be serving are really struggling.
An interesting perspective. Okay, let's move on to healthcare, another huge and complicated issue. They claim that the U.S. healthcare system isn't a real free market. Why do they say that?
Because the government is so heavily involved, both in terms of spending and regulations, the government at all levels accounts for a huge chunk of healthcare spending in the U.S. And then you've got all these regulations that mess with supply and demand, driving up prices and making it harder to get the care you need.
So the government's distorting the market.
That's the argument, yeah.
And they specifically point to insurance companies as part of the problem, right?
Right. They say that because we have these third-party payers, mainly insurance companies, most people are insulated from the true cost of healthcare.
We don't see the bills directly.
Exactly. So we don't shop around as much, we're not as price sensitive, and that drives prices up.
And on the flip side, they talk about restrictions on the supply side, right?
Yeah.
Not enough doctors, not enough hospitals.
Exactly. They say it's really hard to become a doctor or build a new hospital, all because of regulations and barriers to entry. It's like a bottleneck, limiting the supply, which leads to higher costs.
And they have that great story to illustrate this, right?
The one about the dermatologist.
Yeah, the one with the crazy price difference.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. The author needed a cyst removed, and the dermatologist quoted him like $700.
700 bucks.
Yeah. But then he found a doctor in a rural area who charged less than $50 for the same procedure. And the difference was that the rural doctor mainly served patients who paid cash, no insurance involved.
Wow, that's a huge
A
difference.
huge difference. They use that to show how the normal forces of the market are basically broken when you have third-party payers and all these regulations.
So Medicare and Medicaid, they fit into this critique too, right?
Oh, yeah, big time. The book sees them as prime examples of how government intervention can actually create more demand, which pushes prices up.
Because people aren't paying the full cost out of pocket.
Right. They're using these programs, so they're using more healthcare, but they're not as concerned about the price, so the demand keeps going up. And over time, that's shifted who's paying the bill. The government's share has gone up, while the individual share has gone down.
So they're saying these programs are part of the reason healthcare costs so much.
That's their argument. And they also get into the specifics of how the government limits the supply of doctors and hospitals.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one thing, they point to the way medical schools are accredited. It's all controlled by the American Medical Association, and then states have to sign off on it. They say that limits how many new doctors we can train. And a lot of states, like 19 of them, they only have one medical school.
So there's just not enough slots for people who want to be doctors.
Right. Then you've got these certificate of need laws. Basically, if a hospital wants to expand or build a new facility, they need the government's permission.
And that permission isn't always easy to get, I'm guessing.
Nope. So it artificially limits how many hospitals we have, and that drives prices up too.
So less competition, higher prices.
Exactly. And it's not just hospitals, it's insurance too.
Oh yeah, they talk about mandates for insurance companies.
Right. States can require insurance companies to cover certain things like, hair implants or massage therapy.
And their point is,
Well, all those mandates add up and they make insurance more expensive. Plus, it limits what kind of plans people can choose from.
less choice, higher prices. So what's the alternative? What do they propose we do about healthcare?
They talk about this idea called the complete private medical option, or CPMO. Basically, you could opt out of all the government programs like Medicare, Medicaid, everything, and in exchange, you wouldn't have to pay income tax, gift tax, estate tax, all of that.
So you'd be free from government healthcare, but also free from those taxes.
Exactly. The idea is to create a true free market in healthcare that would exist alongside the government system so people could choose what works for them.
Interesting. And do they have any other ideas, maybe something a bit less radical?
Yeah, they talk about letting doctors train and supervise other healthcare professionals to do some of the more routine tasks. Like, a pharmacist could prescribe antibiotics for strep throat, or a paramedic could set a broken bone.
So basically expanding the roles of people who aren't doctors to free up doctors' time.
Exactly. They think that could really improve efficiency and bring costs down. They contrast that with Obamacare, which they see as just adding more fuel to the fire. They say we need radical surgery, not Band-Aids.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about the overall economy. They spend some time on the Austrian business cycle theory. For those who haven't heard of it, can you give us a quick rundown?
Sure. So the basic idea is that when interest rates are kept artificially low, which usually happens because of central banks like the Federal Reserve, you get these booms that aren't really sustainable.
Because the low interest rates are distorting things.
Right. See, interest rates are signals in the market. When they're low, people invest in things they wouldn't normally invest in. They call it malinvestment, like, starting projects that you don't actually have the resources to finish.
They use that master builder analogy, right? Building a house you can't afford to complete.
That's the one. The problem is, when interest rates eventually rise or the easy money dries up, all those investments go bust. And that can trigger a recession.
So they're saying that messing with interest rates can lead to these boom and bust cycles.
Exactly.
And they also argue that government stimulus spending during a recession can actually make things worse. How does that work?
So their view is that recessions are often a necessary correction. It's like the economy's way of purging all those bad investments from the boom period.
Cleaning out the system.
Right. But when the government steps in with stimulus spending, they're trying to prop up those failing businesses, keep things afloat that should probably sink. And they say that prevents resources from being reallocated to more productive uses.
So it delays the inevitable.
Yeah, and it can actually make the downturn last longer.
They also bring up the concept of too big to fail. What's their problem with that?
Well, too big to fail is the idea that Some companies, usually banks, are so big that if they collapse, it would take the whole economy down with them. So the government steps in and bails them out. The problem, according to the book, is that creates a moral hazard.
Meaning,
Meaning, these companies know they'll be rescued, so they take bigger risks. They know taxpayers will foot the bill if things go south, and that can make the whole financial system more unstable.
got it. And they have some pretty good examples of government regulation not working as intended, right?
Oh, yeah, tons of them, like the Madoff Ponzi scheme.
That was a huge scandal.
Huge. And the point they make is that the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, was supposed to be preventing stuff like that. They had more money, more staff, supposedly better regulation, but they still missed it.
Completely missed it.
Completely. There was this private analyst, Harry Markopoulos, who figured it out just by looking at Madoff's returns, something the SEC couldn't do, even though people had been warning them about Madoff for years.
So they're saying that even with more regulation, the system can still be vulnerable.
Exactly. And they point to other regulations like capital requirements for banks that were supposed to make things safer but ended up backfiring.
How so?
Well, these capital requirements basically encouraged banks to invest in mortgage-backed securities because they were considered less risky. But that actually increased the risk for the whole system and contributed to the 2008 crisis.
So the regulation had the opposite effect of what it was supposed to do.
Right. They also talk about the savings and loan crisis and the Icelandic financial crisis.
And their point is that those crises were blamed on deregulation, but they think the government was actually more to blame.
Exactly. They say people keep getting the story wrong, that there's this bias towards blaming the free market when things go bad. They even talk about a conference at Harvard that focused on the free market mindset as the problem.
Like, the problem is that people believe too much in free markets.
That's their take. They say maybe we should be having conferences about the problems with socialism or Keynesian economics instead.
Interesting. And they have this historical example about an economist who changed his mind about inflation, right?
Oh yeah, Condi Raggett. He started out as an inflationist, but then he saw firsthand how paper money inflation messed things up, so he became a big advocate for hard money. It shows you that sometimes experience can really change your views.
That makes sense. So they're not just talking about the economic effects of paper money and inflation.
Right.
They see it as having a much broader impact.
Right. They argue that it affects our society in a lot of ways. It erodes trust, makes people focus on the short term because saving doesn't make sense when your money's losing value.
Yeah.
It can even lead to social unrest because people see prices going up and don't know why.
So it's not just about the numbers.
Nope. It's about how we relate to each other, how we view the future. I think it's pretty philosophical.
They're also critical of the way governments benefit from fiat money, right?
Oh, yeah. They say fiat money lets governments spend without having to raise taxes or borrow as much because they can just print more money.
But that leads to inflation, which is like a hidden tax.
Exactly. And then the government can blame businesses for raising prices, even though it's really their monetary policy that's causing it. They also have a pretty different take on deflation.
Deflation is usually seen as a bad thing, right?
Yeah, like the economy's going into a death spiral.
But they don't see it that way.
Not at all. They say deflation actually benefits consumers because their money buys more. They think the real reason people fear deflation is political.
Like, who benefits from inflation?
Right. People who are in debt and the central banks themselves. They're the ones who don't want to see prices fall.
So they're challenging some pretty fundamental assumptions about how the economy works.
That's a big part of the book.
Okay, so they're not fans of government bailouts and stimulus packages either, right?
Nope. They say those things just delay the inevitable and create even more problems down the line. They point to the GM and Chrysler bailouts, where they say the unions got bailed out, but the creditors got screwed.
And cash for clunkers is another example they use.
Oh yeah, that and the FHA loan guarantees. They see those as attempts to artificially inflate housing prices, which they say just makes the underlying problems worse.
Okay, so they're pretty consistent in their critique of government intervention. What about military spending? What's their take on that?
They argue that spending so much on the military is actually bad for the civilian economy.
How so?
Well, for one thing, it diverts resources, like money and talent, away from other industries that could be more productive.
So it's like an opportunity cost. We're spending money on bombs and tanks that we could be spending on research and development or infrastructure.
Exactly. And they say it hurts our competitiveness because we're not investing enough in the things that really drive economic growth.
Do they have any examples?
They talk a lot about the F-22 fighter jet program, which was super expensive and not very effective. And they point to all sorts of wasteful spending in the military-industrial complex.
The military-industrial complex, that's another term they use a lot.
Yeah, it's basically this idea that the military and the companies that supply them are too cozy, and they push for more and more spending, even when it's not really needed.
So they're questioning the whole idea of having such a large military presence.
In a way, yeah.
Now, they also address some of the common arguments in favor of government intervention. They spend some time talking about the Industrial Revolution. What's their point there?
Well, a lot of people say that the Industrial Revolution was this terrible time for workers, that their living standards went down because of all the factories and harsh conditions.
Yeah, the classic image of the Dickensian factory.
Exactly. But they argue that's not the whole story. They say that if you look at things like wages and access to goods, the average worker in Britain actually saw their standard of living go up during the Industrial Revolution.
Even with the tough working conditions.
Right. They say those factory jobs, even though they were hard, were often better than the alternative, which was usually farm work.
So people were actually choosing those factory jobs.
They were choosing what they saw as the better option.
And they use this thought experiment to illustrate their point about poverty.
Right. Yeah, they imagine the super basic economy where everyone's just making things by hand. And they say that in that kind of economy, the reason people are poor is because productivity is low.
Not enough output per person.
Right. And they argue that the market economy is what drives productivity up. Businesses reinvest their profits in better equipment, competition forces them to be more efficient, and all that leads to lower costs and higher incomes for everyone.
So taxing businesses and profits is actually counterproductive because it slows down that whole process.
That's their argument.
Okay, and they also look at regulations, even those meant to help workers.
Yeah, they use this hypothetical example of like mandating air conditioning in factories in the 1800s. Their point is that even a well-intentioned regulation can have unintended consequences.
Like making it too expensive to run a factory.
Exactly. If the technology isn't there yet, or the economy can't handle the added cost, the regulation could backfire and lead to job losses.
So it's about finding a balance.
Right. And they're skeptical of wealth redistribution programs, too.
Like welfare.
Yeah, they say those programs can disincentivize work and make people dependent on the government. They also point out that a lot of those programs have a lot of bureaucratic overhead, so a lot of the money never actually reaches the people it's supposed to help.
And they use the example of the Social Security death benefit, right?
Yeah, it's only like $250. Their point is that communities and charities could easily handle that kind of thing, and they probably would if the government wasn't doing it.
So they think private charity is more effective.
More effective and more compassionate, in their view.
And they talk about this contrast between America and Europe, right?
Yeah, they say America has this tradition of voluntary association where people come together to solve problems.
Which is different from the European model of relying on the state.
Exactly. And they even challenge the reader directly. Would you be more likely to help the poor if the government wasn't doing it?
Making you think, for sure.
That's their goal. And they also get into higher education.
They don't like government involvement there either, I'm guessing.
Nope. They think federal student loans are a big part of the reason tuition is so high. They use this analogy of a broken leg and a crutch.
The government breaks your leg, then gives you a crutch.
That's the idea. They create the problem, then offer a solution that just makes things worse.
And they have some pretty dismal statistics about graduation rates.
Yeah, they point out that the 6-year graduation rate for bachelor's degrees is really low, even though grades are inflated. They also talk about Milton Friedman's idea of a human capital contract as a way to finance education without relying on government loans.
So students would basically pledge a percentage of their future earnings to investors in exchange for tuition money.
That's the idea.
Interesting. And they have some historical examples of private businesses succeeding without government help, right?
Oh, yeah. They talk about the Great Northern Railroad, which was built without any government subsidies, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, who competed against heavily subsidized steamship lines and still won. They're trying to show that the private sector can do it on its own.
They also argue that a lot of the time it's businesses themselves that are asking for government help.
Yeah, they say businesses lobby for subsidies, tax breaks, regulations that hurt their competitors, protection from foreign competition.
So they're not exactly innocent victims of government intervention.
Not at all. They're often the ones pushing for it because it benefits them. They use the example of the airline industry in the 1950s, where regulations were actually used to protect the big airlines from competition.
Keeping the little guys out.
Exactly. And they critique financial regulation, too.
Like what?
Well, one example is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. That was passed after those big corporate accounting scandals, like Enron.
Supposed to prevent that kind of thing from happening again.
Right. But they argue that it didn't really address the root causes, and it just created a lot of red tape for public companies. They say it might have even discouraged some companies from going public in the first place.
So another example of regulation backfiring.
Yeah. They also talk about how regulations can change people's behavior in unexpected ways, like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Endangered Species Act.
So those are well-intentioned, but they can have unintended consequences.
Right. Like, sometimes people respond to regulations in ways that actually make the problem worse. It's complicated.
And finally, they address this idea that the government should fund basic scientific research.
Which a lot of people see as a core role for the government.
Right. But they disagree.
They say private companies do a lot of basic research too, especially if they think it might lead to profitable products down the line. And they question whether the government is really good at deciding what research is worth funding.
So they're skeptical of government funding for science.
They think it's often misallocated. They're also critical of things like government subsidies to foreign farmers and the war on drugs.
They see that as government overreach.
Yeah, and they argue that those policies are often ineffective and can have negative consequences.
Okay, so we've gone through their whole critique of government intervention. Now let's get to the rollback part, the solutions they propose. They admit up front that these ideas are pretty radical.
Oh yeah, they know they're going against the grain here.
But their argument is that during a crisis, people might be more open to radical solutions.
Right, like when the old ways have failed, you're more willing to try something new.
Makes sense. And they're not too optimistic about traditional politics being able to fix things, are they?
Not really. They point to things like the Republican contract with America in the 90s. That was supposed to be this big change, but it didn't really amount to much in the long run.
So they're not holding their breath for politicians to save the day.
Nope. They think we need a more fundamental shift in public opinion.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. What are some of the rollback ideas they propose?
Well, one big one is letting people opt out of Social Security and Medicare.
Completely opt out.
Yeah, in exchange for not having to pay income tax, gift tax, estate tax, any of that.
So trade-off. You give up the safety net, but you keep more of your money.
Exactly. They also propose across-the-board cuts to all government agencies, like just a flat percentage cut to everything.
A pretty blunt instrument.
Definitely. And they're big on currency competition.
Meaning what?
Basically, ending the government's monopoly on money, letting people use gold, silver, Bitcoin, whatever they want.
So a free market for money.
Exactly. And they even get into things like state nullification, where states could ignore federal laws they don't like.
That's a pretty controversial idea.
It is. They also talk about jury nullification, where jurors can basically acquit someone even if they technically broke the law, if they think the law is unjust.
Interesting. And they mentioned this philosophy called agorism.
Yeah, it's basically about creating a society that runs on voluntary interactions without the need for government.
So pretty radical vision.
Very radical. And they have some ideas about dealing with the national debt.
Which is a huge problem, by the way.
A massive problem. One thing they suggest is just defaulting on the debt.
Just saying we're not paying it back.
Yep. They say it would punish the lenders who enabled the government's overspending and discourage them from lending more in the future.
That would definitely shake things up.
For sure. They also talk about selling off government assets like land and buildings to pay down the debt.
So a pretty comprehensive set of solutions.